local GA branch, Geographical Association branch, the East London Geography Hub, and then ourselves here at Queen Mary. And I'm the current president of the Geographical Association, which is a national association for geography educators. We've got over 10,000 members around the country. And I'm lucky enough actually to be in the room with Denise Freeman, who is a teacher here in East London, who is the vice president of the Geographical Association. So when I finish being president, Denise will become the president after me. So it's great. It's great that we've got a bit of an East London thing going on with the GA at the moment. So what are we going to do today? Well, here's the menu, if you like, for today, if my slides will work. There we go. Let's see if I can I get rid of that at the top? Going again. Sorry for a slight delay. Maybe just have to ignore that that's on the screen at the top. Okay, so what we're going to do this afternoon, first of all, I'm going to introduce the 2021 census to you. It was a census that was taken during a pandemic. We were in the third period of national lockdown, actually, when they took the census last spring. So we're going to talk a little bit about that context. We're going to explain what resources are out there for you to use if you're conducting research about any place, but our example today is going to be London. So I'm going to look at those different resources that are available. Then I'm going to pick out 4 themes that I'm going to be providing some insight into using very recently published census data. So looking at the way London is growing as a city overall, then thinking about questions of inequality and especially deprivation, because that's something that the census seeks to measure. Is London a deprived city? Where is the deprivation? We're then going to think about migration and how migration shapes London. So London is a migrant city. I'll spoiler already that 40% of Londoners were born overseas. So really significant issue for London. So we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to talk about faith in London. So religion and how London remains, in spite of some decline, a relatively religious place within the rest of the country. So that's what we're going to try and cover. I mean, along the way, what I want to do really is to provide you both with insights, but also talk about the kinds of skills that you might use as a geographer to analyze the data that are available to you in the census. Because it might be that as part of a piece of coursework, maybe if you're doing an NEA, you might want to look at some quantitative data and do some analysis on it as part of that project. So hopefully some of the things we'll talk about today will be useful in that context. Sorry, let me just dismiss that message there. So the census, do you remember the census? Do you remember, you maybe didn't fill in the census, maybe you're not old enough to fill it in yourself, but maybe somebody in your household filled it in for you. So the census took place last spring. It was actually during a period of lockdown, as I said a moment ago. It was very well publicized. There were concerns about running a census during a global pandemic, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. But the census is something that we've been doing since, as you probably know, 1801, every 10 years since the beginning of the 19th century, except in 1941, when during the Second World War, they weren't able to conduct the census then. So it happens every 10 years, and it provides this really rich snapshot of how life is changing in Britain. And of course, many other countries also have their own censuses too. But we're going to focus today on the census that was conducted last year, which covers England and Wales, and we'll come back to other countries within the UK and why they're not included in a moment. So it took place on the 21st of March last spring. So really not that long ago, actually. Census Day was the 21st of March. Note that the Scots haven't done their census yet. So this was just England and Wales. They decided because of the pandemic, they were going to postpone it. So I think they're doing it sometime this year. I don't know the exact date. So we've only actually got data at the moment for England and for Wales. And you know, it's hard to say whether that was the right decision or not, but they think it was. We've certainly got some really interesting insights from our census because it was conducted during the middle of a pandemic. So one of the things that happened this time around that was not so much the case previously was that people completed the census online. And that, they argued, was one of the reasons why it was suitable to do it in the pandemic. So people could do it from within their own homes in a relatively safe environment. So it's highly likely that whoever filled it in for you in your household they will have done it online. It was possible also to fill in a paper copy and send it back by post. So for those people who do not have access to the internet and so on, you could do it that way. But most people actually did fill it in online this time round. So that made it quite different too. So you may have noticed, if you've been following the news, that in recent months, the first results of the census have been published. And actually this time round, they've been pretty quick at processing the data and releasing it. So the first results came out actually back in August, in the middle of the summer, the sort of main population statistics. But as you can see here, actually, it's perhaps in the last sort of 4 weeks or so that the most interesting stuff has started to come out. So we had a release back in, that's the next slide actually. We had a release back in, I'll come back to that, beginning of November about migration and its significance in terms of the most recent census. Some really interesting stuff around ethnic group, national identity, language and religion. So that top row there, those are all things that have been published in the last month or so and have caught the media's attention in most cases. And actually there's a fair bit going on this week. So tomorrow, they're going to release some new data around the use of the Welsh language in Wales. So if you live in Wales, that might be particularly interesting to you. And also, this is going to be very rich, I think, some data around the labour market and travel to work later in the week. So this week, again, there'll be new stuff out in the news about this. And then in the new year, there's some further data coming about housing. And there's lots more. We're really just in the very early stages of the data release. I skipped over that. If there's one thing you remember from today, it should be that really, which is where to go and look at the data, find the data, and to look at the various tools that you can use to analyze and see the trends in the data. So the ONS website, so ONS stands for Office for National Statistics, the main government agency, which publishes various data about the UK, including the census. So you can go there to find all the data and all the materials that I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. One other thing to note, an important thing to understand, is that the data that are published by the ONS from the census are released at a range of different geographical scales or for different geographical units. So we have very small units, so what are called output areas, you can see there, and they're the smallest unit, and that would comprise between 40 to 250 households. So the most localized geographical unit at which data are published. And then it builds up to its kind of larger scales, and then also other kinds of geographies. So for example, we'll look at a little bit later, local authorities. So publishing data for each local authority area, which gives us a good insight into the neighborhood in which you might be living. So lots of different census geographies to get your head around. I'm not going to dwell on the detail of that. They do change a little bit from census to census. So if you're comparing over time, that can become quite tricky. But there are some clever sort of geospatial people out there who fix those problems for us so that we can get meaningful analysis and results. So just to note that. The other thing to say is that if you go to that website that I just showed you, you can go and download the raw data if you want to. So on the website, there's analysis for you, and there's some nice graphs and maps and that sort of thing. But if you want to go and play with the data, you can easily do that. And I've been doing a little bit of that today in preparation for this talk. So you can download lots of data already, often as an Excel file. And then if you're good at Excel, maybe you've been trained a bit in Excel at school, college, then you can do some analysis using your skills there. And that's the kind of thing that you end up with. It's not very exciting. So lots of data. In this case, there's a sheet there that is telling us about ethnic identity for each of the local authorities in the UK. And you can see at the top there, at the top of the list, I don't know why it is, but it's Hartlepool up in the northeast. And what you've got on the left-hand side is a code for each of the local authorities. And to the right of that in column B, the name of the local authority. And then the next two columns, C and D, are basically the variable that they're measuring. In this case, it's ethnicity. And then column E there, basically that's just the number of observations. It's a number of people. So if we look at the top line or two there, we can see that in Hartlepool, those people who identify as Asian, Asian British, or Asian Wealth, Bangladeshi, in Hartlepool, there are 278 of them. So real fine-grained data that then sometimes you have to manipulate and aggregate if you want to do some analysis. So that's the kind of thing that's available. And then the other thing, and later on I'm going to demonstrate this, and this is, I think, the best thing actually, the ONS have produced a mapping tool. So very simply, ons.gov.uk/census/maps. Again, well worth going and have a look at. So you can actually use the data and create nice choropleth maps. And I'm going to show you some of those in a minute. So that's really great, and obviously particularly relevant to us geographers because we can see those very nice geographical patterns when we start to play with those tools. Okay, right. Before we move on to start thinking about what the census is telling us about London and how it's been changing in recent years, a little task for you, and this includes people online, who I'd quite like to put something in the chat. Between 2011 and 2021, that last 10 years that we've just been through, what's changed in London that we might be able to see in the census, that we might be able to detect in census data? What have been some of the big things that have happened over the last 10 years that you think might be visible in the census data that we're seeing? So maybe if you're online, you could just type something into the chat and we'll have a look in a minute. Any ideas? And maybe in the room, just talk to the person next to you and then we can collect some ideas in a moment. What's happened that might have influenced the census results? If you look carefully at that slide and its background, there's something there that may have affected what's happened to London's population, or maybe not actually. Have you got some ideas in the room? Okay, right, we're going to collect some ideas from the room and then I'm going to have a look at the chat online. There's 9 new entries to the chat, so I'm not going to show the chat to the people in the room until we've heard from the people in the room, and then we'll look at what everybody said. So what's changed that may have some impact on the census or what we see in the census? Yeah.
Brexit.
Very good, yes, Brexit. So how might Brexit have changed London, do you think? What would be your hypothesis on that?
I think people moving back from the UK to Europe.
Yeah, great. So it may have affected migration patterns, people moving back to Europe. The freedom of movement is something that's now gone, or very recently is gone as a consequence of Brexit. Good. So Brexit's one. Any other things? Is that a pencil up there? Yeah. Yeah. So other migration trends. So what is happening in terms of migration? It's in the news all the time, isn't it? Migration. So you could imagine it's going to be affecting London's population. Good stuff. Any other contributions in the room? Should we see what they put online? Let's have a look at the chat. Right. So let's go up a little bit here. Age structure. So yes, again, something that we've heard quite a lot about, what is happening to the age structure of the UK's population and London's in particular. So we know actually that we're going to get a larger bulge of older people, if that's the right phrase, in the population because of the baby boomers sort of reaching older age. So that's something that we talk about quite a lot, the consequences of that for things like care of older people or things like pensions. So that might be something that will impact London's population. But equally, to go back to a previous point, London is a migrant city and most migrants who arrive here tend to be younger. So perhaps there's something countering that here in London. What else have we got? Change in the ethnic makeup. Yes, good suggestion. I think links with some of the things in the room already. And we'll see some data on that a little bit later. So clearly links a bit with the question of migration may shape the ethnic diversity of London. Religion, so good one. There's been stuff about that in the news. So, you know, is there a relationship perhaps between migration and religion? Do people who arrive here, are they more religious or less religious than groups already here? So yes, I think that's a good one to have in the mix. We've got leaving the EU again, I think a really good one. Nobody's, no, Brexit again, sorry there. So we've got 2 Brexit points. Dip in the actual population, people returning overseas or out of our cities. I think that's a good point, and it may be linked to Brexit, but perhaps also there's an issue there about the pandemic, and we'll see whether that's had an effect in a moment. We'll see some of the discussion that's happening about that. So population size has increased, higher birth rates or migration. So yes, those obviously are going to affect the overall size of the population. We haven't talked much about fertility, that's the birth rate. How's that changing? At the moment, you guys are a little boom in the population. So there's a ripple through the population pyramid, if you like, of people around your age. So there's quite a large cohort of people aged between about 17 and 21. And then there's going to be a bit of a dip in the birth rate, or there was a dip in the birth rate that's going to cause a dip in the population profile after you guys move on as you get older. Very good. Emma says social grade. So has there been a shift in the kind of social diversity, I guess that's referring to, the social structure of the city? And we can begin to detect some of that, I think, from census data. I don't know at the moment, but we'll look at deprivation in a minute. Maybe that will answer something of that question. And Francesca very helpfully pointing out there the ways in which migration has changed. So perhaps because of Brexit, we've seen a decrease in people coming to London from Europe, or at least we've perhaps reasonably hypothesized that, wouldn't we? And perhaps people coming from other parts of the world. So mentioning people coming from South Asia or Southeastern Asia, I guess, as well, Africa, and so on. Yes, and Rupert just clarifying, or Cherwell School, maybe it's everybody there, that the issue is partly about the pandemic and what that might have done. Home working, good point. We'll come to that in a minute. So does that lead to increased counter-urbanisation? Everybody familiar with that term? So people moving out of cities into rural areas, so counter-urbanising. And then what's been the influence of changes in employment? So the rise of 0 hours contracts, the greater number of people freelancing, people working from home. So how's that changed where people might live, for example? So lots there, I think, really useful insights that we can perhaps hang on to as we look at some of the trends. And I'm going to talk to you about trends, and it may be that we need to think about how you try and explain those trends as a geographer. And I think some of those points that you've collectively contributed will be very helpful. Okay, let's carry on. If my slides will move again. Okay, so we shouldn't forget, we're going to talk about London mostly, that this was also have a national census. So London is just a part of the picture. And here then are some of the main headlines. You may have picked some of this up already in the news, but the population of the country as a whole has increased, and it's almost 60 million. So that's quite an easy one to remember, isn't it? Population of England and Wales we're talking about here is now 60 million, or just shy of that. And over time, there's been a steady increase in the population of the UK. So here are all the data going right the way back to 1801, and you can see that increase in the population has been a consistent trend, other than between 1971 and 1981, where it decreased ever so slightly. But basically, you can see the trajectory there. So almost 60 million people living in England and Wales right now. It sort of is fairly logical then that we have more households. So households have grown by 6.1% between 2011 and 2021, almost the same as the population increase of 6.3% between those two dates. The other thing to say, though, would be that the growth in the population has been uneven. So not everywhere in the country is growing at the same rate. So you can see on that map there on the screen that those areas that are coloured orange, and the darker oranges are where you've got the greatest increase, so that those areas have grown more than the other areas. Where you've got blues or greys, that's where actually the population has been in decline. So there's a pretty clear geography to that, isn't there? So you can see that most of the areas that have grown are central, southern and eastern, and it's the sort of western fringes and some of the northern regions that have grown far less. So actually, in terms of regions, it's actually the east of England, which would include East Anglia, that's grown the fastest over the last 10 years. And London's also close to the top two. But as we'll see later, there are some parts of London where the population has declined, although in most areas, like the one we're in now, the population has grown quite rapidly. So there's an uneven geography to the growth of the population in the UK as a whole. A couple of other things we've said already, somebody pointed this out. The population is getting older, so the proportion over 65 is now 18.6% compared with 16.4% back in 2011. And that has some pretty big implications for resources and social care and healthcare spending and all that sort of thing. We're less religious. Maybe you spotted that headline last week. We're not as religious as we were. The people declaring that they don't have any religion has grown quite substantially over the past 10 years. So it's now at 22 million, and it was previously just over 14 million. And then the other important one we'll come back to for London is the number of people born outside the UK. And it's now 1 in 6, as opposed to being 1 in 7 10 years ago. So 10 million people, 10 million out of that 60 million people were born overseas, not born in the UK. So there are some headlines. Before we move on, I wanted to dwell briefly on that question of how the pandemic might have affected the census. Lots of people at the time, so last year, said we shouldn't go ahead with the census. It wasn't the right thing to do it in such unusual circumstances. But in the end, the government and various experts, including people at the ONS, said, well, no, it's the right thing to do. But what effect might the pandemic have had? So here is the statement from the ONS saying that we should go ahead. It's interesting, there's lots of debate about this. This map here needs a little bit of explanation. It's produced by somebody called City Geographics. You can find them online. And it illustrates one of the issues of carrying out a census during a pandemic and a period of national lockdown. And it hints at actually some of the things people have been saying a moment ago when we were collecting ideas. So what it shows, it looks at the difference between the estimates of the mid-year population of different local authorities in England and Wales in 2020. So every year, actually, we estimate the population of different local authorities in the country. So it looks at the difference between what we estimated them to be in 2020 and what we actually measured them to be in 2021 using the census. And in the red areas, or red and sort of orangey coloured areas, in the red areas and orange areas, there were more people in those areas than we estimated there would be in 2020. But then in the blue areas, it's the other way around. So actually there are fewer people in those areas than we estimated there would be in 2020. Now, it's hard to tell on the national map. You can't really see London very well, but if you look at London in particular, this is quite a significant issue for the capital. So actually, most boroughs in London had lower populations in 2021 compared with what they estimated those populations were in 2020. In fact, if you add it all up, they estimated that the population was around about 9 million in 2020, but when we counted it last year, it was 8.8 million. So we've lost 200,000 people somewhere. So that is a problem. Is that real? And there's a big debate amongst demographers as to what's quite going on there. And there are several explanations. One suggests that actually the census is right, and it's just a more accurate way of measuring the population. So in other words, that we got it wrong in 2020 when we were estimating. But the other explanation is to do with the pandemic. And it says that what's happening here is that we're seeing the effects of the pandemic. We're seeing the effect, for example, of very few overseas students coming to study at university in London. who would normally be enumerated as part of the census. So they didn't come here, so we're missing all those people. Maybe we have other people moving out of the city, people moving. There's a bit of a trend, wasn't there, in the pandemic, some people moving away from the city, moving to the countryside, trying to start a new life in that sort of setting. Other groups of people, you know, students who are UK based, maybe staying with family, not coming to London, people who were working in London, younger people returning to live and work from home with family elsewhere in the country. So lots of different factors going on. That's the reason why people think the population appears to have dropped compared to what we estimated it to be. Does that matter? The answer is yes, because there is a real concern that we've really underestimated London's correct population in the census, or we've measured it wrong in the census, and actually we may be missing those 200,000 people. London may have a population of 9 million, not 8.8 million, which has really important consequences for local authorities in London winning resources, for planning for Londoners, all those sorts of things. So lots of concern about this. And the geographer Danny Dorling, who you may have heard of, who's at the University of Oxford, he thinks we should hold another census in 5 years' time to just, you know, work out, you know, whether this is a real trend or whether it was just a blip and we need to rethink resources and so on. So that's why the census does matter. But just to go back to the headline, London has nevertheless been growing. And over the last 10 years, it's grown by 600,000 people. So it's not grown over the last 10 years as fast as it did in the previous decade. So between 2001 and 2011, it grew by about 1 million. So it's been growing more slowly, but it is still growing. And we may be underestimating the actual growth. But again, rather like the national picture we were talking about earlier on, where it's growing and where it's not growing has an interesting geography. So you can see bottom right hand there, you can see London extracted from the national picture. And you'll see that a good part of the capital is growing. So the darker colours there are where it's growing fastest. Tower Hamlets, I think, was the fastest growing borough in London. So that's where we're located right here now. So lots of house building that's been going on in Tower Hamlets, and that's part of the explanation, as well as maybe some of the sort of regeneration stuff that's happening. Similarly, we saw high rates of growth in boroughs like Newham. We've got Barking and Dagenham there. So places to the east, Waltham Forest also. Then if you go to the west, the darker colours, they're the boroughs of Hillingdon and Hounslow. And then in the sort of south west there, you've got Sutton. So those are the areas that have been growing fastest and quite considerably over the last 10 years. But look, there in the middle, we've got some places in blue that have been shrinking in terms of population. So those boroughs are Kensington and Chelsea, Westminster and Camden. So it's not been an even picture, again, across the city as a whole. Okay, so that's the first of my themes, first of my 4 themes dealt with. The second theme is to think about what the census reveals about questions of inequality, and particularly deprivation. We know that London is a highly unequal city. It's captured in that image there of poor housing in Poplar near the Isle of Dogs, and then you can see Canary Wharf in the background. That sort of really underlines the inequalities we see. Lots of geographers have written about London as an unequal city. So a book there by a geographer formerly at King's College called Chris Hamnett. So the census does tell us about deprivation. It measures deprivation. And this shows us this graphic here, which I took from the London Data Store, which is another good resource if you want to explore this further. It shows us which boroughs within the city are the most deprived. So it's ranked them, and at the top there we've got Barking and Dagenham, which comes out as the most deprived borough in the city, and then the least deprived at the bottom there, Richmond upon Thames. It's quite complicated, actually, the way that the census measures deprivation, and it does it according to several dimensions. So that's why, if you look at the key, it says deprived in no dimensions, 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, and then 3 or 4 dimensions. And very briefly, to explain what those dimensions are that it's measuring, one of them is about employment. So it looks at whether there is any member of a household who is not a full-time student who is unemployed or long-term sick. So if there is somebody like that in your household, then that's one dimension of deprivation. Next is education. So deprivation where no person in the household has at least a level 2 qualification, i.e. 5 or more GCSE passes or above. And then another one is health and disability. Does somebody have a long-term health problem or a disability? And then the final one is about housing. So are people living in overcrowded housing or a dwelling that doesn't have central heating? So that's the way they measure deprivation here. And that graphic gives you a sense of the ranking within London, the most deprived to the least deprived, according to those measures. And there it is mapped. That's just looking at average levels of deprivation. And actually, I think when you look at that map there, it doesn't suggest there's a huge amount of variation across the capital. So there we're looking at deprivation measured at the ward level. So different wards make up local authorities, and that's what you see there. So one thing you can do then is to go and do some analysis of this yourself. And that's what I attempted to do in preparation for today. So I went and downloaded the data and I created my own spreadsheet in Excel, something maybe you could try for yourself. And what I wanted to look at was deprivation at ward level. And so I downloaded the data and then I did some statistical analysis in a different software package, something called SPSS, which we teach here at university. I don't know whether you may use it at school or college. You could also do this using Excel. And I'm not going to talk about what I did, but I did some analysis to compare deprivation in inner London with outer London. So we've got the data. We can look at the different local authorities. There's a list of which are defined as inner London and which are outer London, because I wanted to see whether there is any difference between deprivation in inner and outer London. You might imagine that the outer boroughs were perhaps more wealthy and you get lower levels of deprivation. So you can see actually when you see it plotted there on a graph, and what we've got there are what are called box plots. On the left-hand side, you've got inner London, on the right-hand side, outer London, and we're looking at percentages of households where deprivation is there in at least 2 of those dimensions I just defined for you. And a box and whisker plot, if you've never encountered one before, the thick black line in the middle is the median. If you put all your data in order from the lowest to the highest, the least deprived to the most deprived, the one that lies in the middle is that thick black line there. And then the blue box is the middle 50% of your observations, the middle 50% of your boroughs in this case. Anyway, we don't need to know the detail. Actually, what it's showing is that inner and outer London are fairly similar. If you look at the mean, the average for inner and outer, you can see that inner London is slightly higher at 19.2%, and outer London is slightly lower, 18.3%. And then you can do some statistics on it. And if you do a statistical test, then it shows you that the difference between inner and outer London is not statistically significant. So just illustrating what you can do with this data that you might do as part of your own investigation or research project. Right, let's move on. We've talked about deprivation. Now we're going to talk about migration. And this is something that really did catch the headlines. So here are 2 images courtesy of the Daily Mail, who actually are quite good at creating graphics and tables using census data. Their reporting of some of these trends it might be questioned, but this is certainly something that captured the media's attention last week or the week before when this data was published. So the fact that 16.8% of the population of England and Wales were born overseas, 1 in 6 people was born overseas. And then you can see here on the right-hand side at a national level, as in England and Wales level, where these people were born. So India being the most significant group there. So there's lots of this in the media. It gets very politicized, sometimes quite unpleasantly. So Nigel Farage, using data on migration, but also using data on ethnicity, started making claims about London being minority white, effectively a racist claim. And that was proven to be, very quickly proven to be untrue. If you look at the data, you can go and have a look at the data for yourself. You can do the stats pretty easily. And that was challenged rightly by the BBC. So it's caught people's attention, the data on migration and how it shapes London. And the first thing I'm going to say to you is that there's actually nothing new about the significance of migration in shaping London as a city. And this is quite old. This goes back to 1881, so the census 140 years ago. And the key number here, you can't read that over there, is a number down at the bottom, and it shows you that at that time in East London, so the area of London we are today, 3.21% of the population was born overseas then. So, okay, it's not like the 40% we've got now, but London, even in the late 19th century, was quite a diverse place with lots of people born overseas. And again, this probably doesn't fully capture the large numbers of people from overseas who were coming through East London in that later 19th century period. So migration has been more important recently, but it was important over 100 years ago to London too. So that puts a bit of context to the theme. So here's the sort of national picture for that. And again, relatively easy to understand. For those maps there, the darker colours are where you've got the higher proportions of people born overseas. So you can see if you look at England and Wales as a whole, London certainly stands out, as also do some of the other major cities, urban areas in the West Midlands, around Birmingham, around places like Leicester, and then go further north, Manchester, and so on. So it's in those metropolitan areas in particular that you see the highest rates of people who've been born overseas. And London is picked out in both cases. On the right-hand side here, we see change since 2011 in terms of the numbers of people born overseas. And again, it's a similar picture to the other map too, that it's the metropolitan areas where you've seen the increases in people born overseas. So that's a national picture. And then we can start to zoom in and look at what it looks like in London. So this is a screenshot of that mapping tool that I mentioned earlier on. And again, the darker colours there tell us where people born overseas tend to live within the city. What I'm going to do actually now is to just come out of my presentation and show the actual website. And I need to work out how to stop share and reshare. Share my screen, which one? Right. People online, I hope you can see that. Okay, so I'm in this mapping tool now, which looks something like this. And you can see here, I've zoomed into London a little bit. Let me zoom out again. On your left-hand side here, you have various data that you can then plot on your map. And then on the right-hand side of the map itself, at the moment, nothing plotted. So we were just looking at migration statistics. So if we click on population, I think country of birth, where people were born. So here we've plotted the data I was just talking about, and we can zoom into London, and you can click on any area. So we can click on Tower Hamlets, which is where we are right now. We can see that 53.2% of people in Tower Hamlets were born in the UK. Let's do it the other way around, since we're interested in that. So obviously the opposite of that, it's 46.8% born outside of the UK. And you can see, you zoom in, you actually zoom right into a map of the area with all the streets and houses on them. At the moment, they've not released the data for anything below ward level. So you can't, sorry, not ward level, I mean local authority level. So you can't really drill down, but as I'll show you later, you can do for other kinds of variables. So you can see here, we can do a more detailed analysis. So if we want to know where in London people born in, say, the Americas and Caribbean are most concentrated, let's just zoom out so you can see it more clearly. So that gives you a sense of that. And you can click on any borough and it will give you the precise percentage. So 6.2% for Hammersmith and Fulham, for example. Let's pick another one that might be different. Let's look at Irish in London. There's a pattern for Irish people. Again, we can zoom in. So this is a really useful tool, and you can find your neighborhood. And obviously, it doesn't have to be London, it can be anywhere in the country. You can start to build up a kind of profile, a demographic profile of who's living there and where they come from. So that's really helpful. So I'm going to go back to my presentation. Should I be okay? Just that should be fine, shouldn't it? Right. Okay. So London is a migrant city, and the data show us where different migrant groups in the city are based, where they live. There's all sorts of other data. This is, I suppose, associated to some extent with some of that data. This is the data on ethnicity. So when you fill in the census, you're asked to declare or define yourself in terms of a list of categories. And here, for example, I've mapped the people who have described themselves as white British, or just white actually in this case. And this tells us where in London those populations live. Again, let's pick a different one just so you can contrast it. Black, British. Whoops. No, I can't do that. I'm not on the live map. But you get a sense of some of the things you could do, and you could explore this for your part of town. We'll come back to that. Okay, this is my final theme, which is to think about how people's religious belief has been changing according to the census over the past 10 years. So you may have seen again the press publicity around the fact that the proportion of people in the UK, in England and Wales, who are Christian, according to the census, is now less than 50%. So that was seen as a big deal by some of the press. And it's interesting, actually, there was quite a lot of campaigning around how people should answer that question in the census about what religion you are. There's a belief that in the past, people have just generally ticked Christian, not really thinking about it. So there was a campaign by one of the secular organisations to say, you know, if you're not religious, don't tick one of the boxes. You don't have to answer that question. Or just put you're not religious, which is one of the options too. So maybe that campaign is something to do with why the numbers have shifted since 2011. So again, there's more maps we can look at. Here we've got plotted for the entire country, no religion. So the darker the colour, that means there's a greater proportion of people who do not have a religion. They click the no religion box. And you can see immediately here that compared to the rest of the country, actually London is relatively religious. So, you know, that really does stand out. Again, it's some of the other metropolitan areas where you tend to find more faith or more evidence of faith using census data. So here again, we can actually do stuff with the data, and I downloaded all the data for 2021, and I also downloaded the data for 2011, and I sort of compared them and did a little bit of analysis for you. Here's the spreadsheet I created, and that's the kind of slightly crazy thing you can create, but I don't think that's very intelligible from where you're sat. So what that's telling us is the way in which religious belief has changed for each of the different London boroughs over the past 10 years. So I decided to abandon that one, but I just wanted to show you how crazy it looks and do something a little bit more straightforward, which is sort of trying to get at the same thing, but is looking at inner London and outer London, and which I think demonstrates the trends. So we've got inner London blue, outer London orange, and then grey is the whole of London. And then we've got the different religions that the census uses, the categories it uses along the bottom there. So you can see actually in London, the general trend is that the number of people declaring a religion has declined, and you can see therefore an increase in the no religion category, and you can see a decrease within certain religions, so Christian consistently, Buddhist mostly, Jewish partly, Sikh a little bit. But then other faiths have actually grown quite substantially. So Hindu, Islam, and then a category which is other religion, which includes all sorts of different things, like Jain, for example, would be one of the religions that falls into that group. So actually quite a lot of newer religions in London that come into that category. So my argument here is that London remains actually interesting because it's still quite a faithful city, you could say. So it's more religious than other parts of the country, but also more religiously diverse than other parts of the country. So just over a quarter of residents report a religion other than Christian in London, and that's an increase of about 4% since 2011. So London's still a religious city, and I think that's an important thing to hold on to when we think about the world being more and more secular, because it's not particularly true of many parts of London. And again, our maps here are great. You can sort of plot where different religious groups are located in the city. So there we've got Islam, Muslim people, for example. And in this particular place, the data are available at a really local level. So you can zoom right in. And the map you're looking at on the screen there is a map of where we are now. And in the center of that map, or just to the left of the center, you can actually see where we are literally right now, Queen Mary. So for those in the room, it's this green area here. And that tells us, roughly speaking, that the population within Queen Mary and its immediate areas just around it is between 5 and 15% Muslim. And it's interesting, if you cross the road, you go down here, that area is 92% Muslim. So you can really get a very detailed, fine-grained analysis of different parts of the city by zooming right in that particular case. And I think eventually lots of the census data will be available at that resolution. And one thing that they're promising very soon, in fact, is that the data, you'll be able to create local area profiles. So you'll be able to go in and create an interesting profile of your local neighborhood. The final thing I did, you can use the data to do your own further analysis. So I decided earlier today to do some bivariate analysis, where I tried to look at the relationship between two of the variables that I've just been talking to you about. So one of them is religious, or religious belief, and the other one is people born overseas, because I wanted to see whether there is a relationship between the proportion of people living in a local authority that was born overseas and the proportion of people declaring a religious belief. So I kind of had a hunch, a sort of hypothesis, if you like, that there might be a relationship there. And you don't need to understand the stats on the screen to get the message. What it shows us is that there is a bit of a relationship. There's a positive association between a proportion of people born overseas and a proportion of people declaring as religious. So as one grows, so does the other. And if you know what a correlation coefficient is, which I know many of you will do, then if you do a Pearson's R correlation coefficient, then you get a value of 0.491, which suggests a sort of moderate strength correlation between proportion of people born overseas and proportion of people who are religious. And then you could do some regression analysis on that if you wanted to. So there's an association. That makes sense, perhaps, doesn't it? People coming here with strong religious belief. Okay, so to finish up then, I think the census is really fascinating, and it's such a rich resource for geographers. London is an exciting city because it is constantly changing, and we have these snapshots every 10 years where we get a sense of what those changes are. As I say, there is something coming out very soon called an area profile builder. That's what it was actually called, and I think that's going to be a particularly helpful resource if you're studying changing places, which many of you will be as part of your A-level, where you can pick on your locality and you can build this nice little profile of what that locality is like and compare it to what it was like previously at the last census. Final thing to say is that the census is actually something produced by geographers. So many of the people who did geography A-level and went on to university, maybe specialized in data science, data analysis, or geospatial skills, GIS, things like that, then those are the people actually doing the work behind the census, producing the analysis, producing that mapping tool. So here are a couple of people who were profiled recently by the Royal Geographical Society for their work in producing the census. So if data interests you, and if changing geography, social geography interests you, then perhaps there's a career in this sort of thing for you. So I'm going to end there. I'm very happy to take any questions both online using the chat, but also from anybody in the room. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Thank you.
You know, when you said that students, etc., not coming over from overseas might not be included in the population, would they for that census anyway, though? So do the student fill out census if they're temporary residents?
If they're here on census date, they should do, yeah.
Oh,
They should fill in complete a sentence.
I thought it was only
Census.
for someone who was
Good question. And there's a lot of undercounting goes on where people don't fill out a census. Lots of homeless population, for example, who perhaps don't have access to it. Is that question over there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you talked a bit about declaration. Have you seen any? You talked about how large it is in certain areas. Have you seen any changes over the past 10 years?
I mean, in general, London seems to be becoming a little less deprived than it used to be. I think with deprivation, one of the things that I didn't do and actually couldn't do because I couldn't get the data is that I think you've got to look at the data at a more localized level to understand deprivation in London. Because I don't know, how much of London you know, but if you walk around London and you look at areas that are wealthy and poor, or apparently wealthy and poor, then often they're right next to each other, aren't they? So actually looking at the scale of local authorities, you're not going to detect the kind of inequalities, often really quite extreme inequalities that you can find in London. Where I live, I live on a street that's sort of quite mixed and some of it's quite gentrified. The houses around me are kind of quite nice, done up, wealthy people living in them. But behind us, it's really quite poor. So you get those really steep shifts in the kind of social, the kind of social levels within the city. So I think, yeah, that deprivation question, I think we've got to wait for somebody to do more of that fine-grained analysis to understand what the pattern is. It used to be the case that the most deprived areas in the country, the most deprived wards, which are subunits of local authorities, they were nearly always in London, and they were nearly always Hackney, Tower Hamlets, Newham. Whether that's changed because of gentrification and processes like that, we've got to wait for the analysis, I think.
I was interested in the national, the Wales data on population growth and household growth, and it looked like households haven't increased as much as population. Which you think there about maybe it's about young people living at home for longer, for example, so delay in becoming their own households, or patterns of increase in housing overcrowding. So the housing data really interesting a bit, which is a simple difference between population growth and household growth.
That's right. One was sort of 6.1% and one was 6.4 or something, which may seem small, but actually probably quite significant, as you say. And maybe goes back to the question also of house building not keeping pace with population increase. But I'm sure those other factors you've just mentioned are all part of the story. So yeah, the data release in January, I think housing data is coming out. That should give us a bit more of an insight there. Yeah.
So the census is taken every 10 years. I think that the census should be taken like in a shorter period of time because 10 years is quite broad. So
yeah.
Data can change very quickly in comparison to what the census might be.
That's right. And I think, the reason I asked you to think about the reasons why London may have changed over the last 10 years was just to underline how much has happened in those 10 years. So, yes, I think in some ways it would be desirable to have data more regularly. And, there have been proposals to try and do that, and actually perhaps to abolish the census and have other kinds of data capture events more regularly. But I think the main reason why we don't have censuses every, say, 5 years or something like that is just the sheer cost of running them. I mean, maybe that will be less so as we move everything online, but that in the past has been the main argument put forward as to why we can't do them every 5 years. Yes, I'll come to the questions online in a minute. There's a couple online too.
Do we know what the cost is?
Good question. I don't actually, off the top of my head. We could look it up, find out. But it's a major investment. Should we see what questions they've put online here? So, excellent. So Francesca says, when do you think we will have the full analysis completed? Well, if you look at the ONS website, they do actually stipulate a kind of planned program of data releases. Sometimes they get a bit delayed. But for the last census, to answer a slightly different question, it took more or less 5 years before all the data were released. I think they're hoping to do it a bit quicker this time around. What will be different this time around is that the Scottish data are going to be a bit later. So in fact, they're not going to quite gel with the English and Welsh data, and indeed the Northern Irish data. I don't know what's happening in Northern Ireland. Okay, so is there a future for the 10-year census? Yes, so a similar question here. Surely the data can be collected in other ways rather than waiting for each 10 years. Is it value for money? So yeah, I mean, similar question to one posed in the room. Some people do think we should get rid of it. There are other ways of doing it. And actually, you know, the kind of sophistication of modeling and prediction and making estimates is such that we don't need to do the real counts as much or as frequently as we do. So who knows whether we will have another one. Other countries are still doing them, and that's perhaps the reason why we would continue. Great. So if you are online, as Said has put in the chat there, we've got some evaluation forms. If you would kindly fill one of those in, that would be great. I don't know if we have a paper copy in the room. Or we'll send you some. Yeah, fabulous. Okay. Any final questions before we wrap up? Okay, well, thank you all very much indeed for coming.
Well, thank you, Alastair. It's been hugely interesting and such a resource. If you'd like to have a coffee or tea before you go, grab biscuits or just grab biscuits and go, do help yourself. But thank you so much, Alastair. It's really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Right now.